The FBR presents a forecast on an annual basis that what is the target which they are going to achieve based on the economic growth which is presented by the Planning Commission. Now, if there is some change in the growth, like we know that the targets are set higher, whereas the growth actually is lesser, the FBR is not allowed to reduce their targets. Although the forecasts are based on parameters, but the targets are set in absolute. So that results the FBR going into mini budgets and others. That if we develop the markets which are required for economic growth, that may actually leads to a second round impact in terms of having more returns. Like for example, take the FBR rates. Mentioning that the FBR rates had been re-evaluated and made at par with the market is not the solution. The problem actually lies in the real estate markets, and we need to develop that, and that is actually going to resolve our crisis in terms of true values for our taxes as well.
Pakistan's fiscal deficit, as you can see, over time, it has been growing, right? In FY22, it was 7.9% of GDP, right? And the largest in 22 years. And we are forecasting for this fiscal year actually goes up to 8%, which could be the largest on record. Now, given that you have had deficits for such a long time, the average for the past 10 years was like 6.2%, right? It's persistent, it's large. What happens is that the losses, right, from each year accumulate to debt, public debt. And on the right-hand side, what we have shown is that what we're plotting is public debt and guaranteed debt as a share of GDP. And you can see it's persistently growing larger, right? Losses from each year accumulate into debt. Now, what is the big deal? Why are we worried about deficits? Why are we worried about debt? So, deficits and the debt actually lead to imbalances in the rest of the economy. When the government spends a lot, right, aggregate demand goes up, economic growth goes up, and then the country imports a lot. But if you're not investing in the productive capacity of the economy, you can't really export. Which means what you're doing is you're buying a lot from the rest of the world compared to what you're selling, right? So this leads to a trade deficit, and it shows up as a current account deficit. Again, we're buying a lot from the rest of the world, a lot more than what we're selling. So what you see is that the fiscal deficit tends to move together with the current account deficit. When you have a large current account deficit, you can't earn enough foreign currency to pay for the exports, then you lead into a shortage of foreign exchange. And this, you can't run out of foreign exchange, you have to implement cooling measures. So back to Matthew's presentation, where we show that the frequency of economic crisis tends to get closer and closer. You have more recurrent of this sort of boom-bust cycle. So all that is actually bad for the economy. Economic volatility is bad. Now, another angle to look at it is when you have so much deficit and you have so much debt, right? Where is the government borrowing from? A lot of it to finance the deficit is actually from the domestic banking sector, right? And what we have on the right-hand side actually shows the amount of government borrowing from the domestic banks. And you can see there's a clear upward trend, right? In FY23, almost 75, almost 3/4 of domestic banking credit is going to the government, right? But then, what is left for the private sector? Only 1/4, right? So, for Pakistan, on the left-hand side chart, you actually see the amount of credit going to the private sector. And when you compare it across other similar countries, you can see it's low on a cross-country comparison, right? Definitely it's quite low. What happens? When the private sector do not have that good access to credit, they cannot really invest. And lo and behold, on the right-hand side, you see that Pakistan's investment as a share of GDP is also low, right? So all this is that when you have a large persistent deficit, you have imbalances in the rest of the economy. When you have low investment, productivity is low, the productive capacity of the country cannot grow as fast. So this is why we are worried about deficits and debt. Now this morning, I'm just going to restrict my presentation to 2 ways in which we recommend decreasing the fiscal deficit. First is on revenues, right? And second is on expenditures. On the left-hand side, what we have plotted is total government revenue as a share of GDP over time. 2 points to take away is that from what we have in the latest is around 11.5% of GDP, total government revenue, right? What you take away from this chart is that it's actually low and actually pretty stagnant. There were times in Pakistan's history where the revenue to GDP ratio is higher. So more or less, what we're trying to do in terms of reforms hasn't really worked, right? Now, when you compare across the region, we also see that Pakistan's tax to revenue revenue to GDP is low compared to other South Asia countries. Let's go beyond that and look at across the world. Now, what we have down here is we tried to predict countries' tax to GDP ratio based on the fundamentals, the macro, the demography, and the institutional characteristics. If you are on this black line, it means that you're very close to your predicted value based on your fundamentals. And you can see that Pakistan is just a little bit higher than its predicted value, means that it's quite close to where it should be based on its macro, its demographics, and institutional characteristics. But another point to take away is that you see out of all these countries where Pakistan is situated, right? Its tax to GDP ratio is really one of the lowest in the world. Another reason why this could be, as we see as a contributing factor, is the cost of tax expenditures. What are tax expenditures? There are special rules, in your tax code that gives preferential treatment to a special group of institutions or individuals or special activity. So these are those people or those activities with special rules that enables them to pay less taxes. Now what we have down here is just taking the tax expenditure statements compiled by FBR, right? Every year they have tax expenditure statements. And what do we see when we take all those special treatment that they give to all sorts of institutions in the economy is that when you compute it across GDP, your tax expenditures actually went down until FY22, but then started going up again. Now, if you actually were to eliminate all these tax expenditures, your revenue to GDP could actually jump up by 2.7%, right? Which is substantial, given that you have somewhere like 11% right now. That would really be good. Now, according to the FBR, a large chunk of your tax expenditures actually comes from the sales tax. So what we have done, we actually use the data in FY19 to compute this. How much would Pakistan gain or the sales tax grow if we weeded out all the exemptions, all the concessionary rates, and all the zero ratings? So in FY19, the actual sales tax collected by the federal government was around 3.3% of GDP. Now, if we all reduce all those tax expenditures, the potential collection could go up to like 3.95. So an increase of like 0.5, 0.6% of GDP. So that's pretty significant. We made another calculation. At that time, what if you reduce the threshold? In FY19, the threshold was around like 5 million rupees per year. If you reduce it to 0, how much revenue could the sales tax collect? It will be around 6.5% of GDP. So those are large. Those are large things that the government could consider to improve tax collection. Another thing that we looked at was the tobacco excise. Now, the tobacco excise, how it's structured in Pakistan, at least currently, is that you have a cheap brand of cigarettes, right, in which one excise tax is levied on it. I think it's like 5.05 rupees per stick. And then you have the more premium brand, which the excise goes up to like, I think 16 rupees per stick or per pack. Now, what we have calculated here is that in FY19, in FY21, what was actually collected was like 0.2% of GDP, right? But potential, if you take account of all those people are consuming cigarettes and if there's no leakage and everybody pays the excise, should have collected around 0.23, right? Now, with the reforms over the years where cigarette excise has been increased, in FY23, the potential for excise collection should jump up to like 0.73. Now, we made a recommendation that, when you have 2 tiers of excise taxation, there's always the incentive for companies to try to pay the lower excise, even when they're selling the more premium brand, right? Because it's cheaper, they pay lower excise. Now, if we were to eliminate the 2 tiers, and only have one, and apply the single rate to all cigarettes, then the collection will jump up to 1.1% of GDP. So again, it's not insignificant. So these are 2 ways we suggest in terms of increasing revenues. Going to go very quickly about expenditures. Federal government spending largely is what we call quite rigid. It is, for federal, is around 14% of GDP. It's been quite stable over the past 10 years. Now, this is not particularly high when you compare cross-country, right, globally. The one thing that we notice is very characteristic is a large percentage of it is rigid. In a sense, it's pre-committed. More or less, you have to spend that amount of money unless you do deep reforms. So 2/3 or more than 2/3 about it is quite rigid. What are those rigid components? When you look at this side, you see a large part is your interest payments. Of course, you need to pay the interest payments on your debt. You do not want to default. Another large part comes from your subsidies, right? How much you're giving for subsidies in all sorts of areas. And the last one is actually your salaries and pensions, which we had the PIDE presentation talked on. So I'm going to talk a little bit about subsidies. Expenditure on subsidies over the years, it has been falling down. But recently, it's shot up, right? Now, what is so wrong about subsidies? You are trying to help the poor. There's nothing wrong with that. But when you give a universal or non-target subsidies, there are issues, there are leakages. So what we show here is an example of electricity subsidies. The height shows how much households are consuming electricity. And on the horizontal axis, we have done it by the income distribution, the poor and the rich. Takeaway is that, no brainer, the rich households consume more electricity, right? So if when you give a subsidy, the rich households actually gain more. And when you look at when we try to capture the benefits from electricity subsidies, let's say 2019, you do see that your poorest households, out of 1 rupee or 100 rupees being spent by the government, only 24 rupees goes to the poor households. The rest goes to your non-poor households. So in a sense, there's a leakage, there's a huge leakage. But the federal government is aware of this, and they've been doing reforms. In 2022, together with the World Bank operation on PACE, they were actually changing the electricity subsidies. What happened? They did it in such a way that is less regressive. So comparing what we had to the new system in 2022, where the poor actually now gain majority of the benefits, right? And the rich are still gaining, but much less. So that's a huge improvement. But where our point is that, to some extent, it could be even made better. So what we have down here are the benefits captured under BIS, the Conditional Cash Transfer Program. Now, BIS targeting system is actually very good, very precise, and you can see it here. In that, the poor, when a government spends 100 rupees on conditional cash transfers through BIS, they capture 81 rupees, right? Only 20% or 20 rupees are actually being wasted or leakages. The point is that if the government wanted to reduce poverty, they can actually take the money from subsidies, put it into BIS, and they will see a lot more effect in poverty alleviation. Or you want to do the same amount of poverty reduction, you can actually move from subsidies to BIS and get some savings, right? So that is the point about subsidies, that universal subsidies are not a good idea. Now, another point that we try to make, 2 minutes, okay. Another point that we try to make is on the structure of the federal government. Now, we know in the 18th Amendment, in 2010, a lot of ministries or a lot of functions of the government were devolved to the provinces. Things like health, education, social protection are supposed to be the responsibility of the provinces. However, when you look at the spending by the federal government, you see that before the 18th Amendment and in FY22, after the 18th Amendment, the part that is being spent on non-devolved functions is actually gone up, right? So the federal government, despite these roles going to the provinces, have maintained a slightly larger expenditure on these devolved functions. So this is the area that we think is a potential for the government to save money. Now, big picture. When you look at expenditures for the whole country, and you just look at the shares, the federal government spends about 2/3, the provinces spend about 1/3, right? Now, but due to the NFC, that was also done in 2010, a certain share of your revenues, 57.5% of your revenues, must go to the provinces. So, of all the revenues that's collected by Pakistan, federal government only keeps 46.1%, right? So they are responsible for a majority of the expenditures, but they don't keep most of the revenue, right? So what do you expect to happen in terms of the budget deficit? When you look at the budget deficit before the 18th Amendment, you can see it averaged 1.8%, and the primary deficit was smaller, 0.3. After the 18th Amendment, post-2010, when you look at the average, it's more than double. Same thing on the primary deficit. So here's the thing about there's also, we think ways to tackle this, also we need to look more at the fiscal architecture of how the things are done. Okay, well, with that, thank you very much.
Thank you, Derek, for an excellent presentation. Thank you, PIDE and World Bank, for providing us the forum actually to engage on issues. And this is what our Vice Chancellor has earlier mentioned, that we want to develop a common agenda which has inclusivity in the sense of ownership of whatever we are recommending. Now, the discussion which we just had is quite large. So it's very difficult to sum it up in terms of some comments. But the good thing is that since PIDE has also been working on these issues, so we can give some our ideas on how we can actually improve what World Bank has been saying. Some things are common, which we have actually also identified in the write-up, that these are something which on PIDE also agrees. But specifically speaking on the taxation side, we have a bit of different opinion, which we would like to share with the audience here, as well as we have done some write-up on that. So to start off with, when we talk about the fiscal side, actually it's the outcome. It's not the variable itself. So I'll start from the last discussion which we had on the subsidies. For example, the energy subsidies, what PIDE has been suggesting is to develop the energy market. It is going to take care of all the fiscal evils which are embedded in it. The problem with, say, agriculture subsidies can be done away with if the agriculture markets are developed. So just thinking about the fiscal variables from a fiscal perspective is not actually going to solve our crisis. And this is what Dr. Nayab has also mentioned earlier, that until unless you start off with the civil bureaucracy or the ones which are actually making the decisions or the whole system, we are never going to resolve this crisis. Just by looking at the end symptoms is not going to actually solve our problem. So this is what we have to understand. And specifically talking about the taxes, we believe that the obsession with the tax to GDP ratio actually has led to the FBR chasing a pursuit which is not justifiable in an economic sense. The World Bank report also mentioned the incidence of withholding taxes to be as high as 70%. So that means that the FBR is actually not collecting any revenue by themselves. It is the job which is done by the private agents. Why have they come to that? Because there is a pressure for them to maintain the tax to GDP ratio. Now, from where does this tax to GDP ratio actually comes? The FBR presents a forecast on an annual basis that what is the target which they are going to achieve based on the economic growth which is presented by the Planning Commission. Now, if there is some change in the growth, like we know that the targets are set higher, whereas the growth actually is lesser, the FBR is not allowed to reduce their targets. Although the forecasts are based on parameters, but the targets are set in absolute. So that results the FBR going into mini budgets and others. So as a comment, what we have noted is that actually we have not learned from the past. Tax has been on the reforms radar since inception and more profoundly after the 90s. But what we have learned from all the reform process which has been done till that time is actually not included in the discussion or the report. This is what was missing from the outset. And PIDE has produced a book on it. Dr. Ikramul Haq actually contributed towards producing a very good book in terms of what we have learned from the experiences of the past. So based on that, what we believe is that tax to GDP ratio, comparing it across countries, is not the right way to look at the performance of our tax collecting authorities, because as the World Bank report themselves mentioned, that we are above the predicted value of the tax. So that means that we are already doing good. So why to then penalize the tax system to collect more, whereas they are already performing good in the sense of collecting taxes? So the problem is actually lying somewhere else. So it's not the rates, it's not the increasing in the potential taxes, rather it is the way the taxes are collecting. So this is what the PIDE strategy on taxes has been to propose to simplify the taxes and make it more growth oriented rather than just based on the numbers. Now, on the other side, since Derek has also presented some bits on the expenditures, this is what the fiscal is about. Taxes are collected on the benefit principles. If the society by and large doesn't agree on the fiscal side to be delivering them the required goods and services, they are not going to be willing to pay much. So we have a system now which is not performing in the sense of the service delivery, whereas the extraction is at the top over and above what is required. So this needs to be actually solved, and without that we cannot think about having a sustainable fiscal platform. And fortunately, PIDE has also done work on the expenditure side as well. Like, for example, there was just a mention on doing the required public investment. But if you look at the public investment, you find out that most of the public investment is going into the projects which are not contributing. And some of you who are basically economists, if you look at the ICORs, the rate of return on the investments, the public projects for which the funding is done are at the lowest or the bottom. So any investment which is going to be done through the PSDP does not necessarily leads to economic growth. So just saying that the taxes needs to increase so that we can facilitate more public investment is not going to resolve our economic crisis. So this is what we have to think about. Now, going in terms of specific tax proposals, without thinking about the economics of the proposals, it is going to be disaster. For example, increasing the property tax, since there is a gap which needs to be bridged, without thinking that what is going to be the liquidity position for the ones which are going to pay the taxes. Is there some progressivity in that tax? What about the equity principle? And what about the other ills which are related to suddenly if something comes out? And as Dr. Nadeem has rightly mentioned, just for the pursuit of the taxes, we would find out deemed income, 7E, withholding taxes, taxes on a number of products which are practically not economic. Having transaction-based income withholding taxes actually kills the transaction itself. And on the trade side, almost 70% of our taxes are collected from the international trade. So that actually shows the pressure on the tax authorities of making bad policies rather than doing the policy in the right manner. So what PIDE believes is that if we develop the markets which are required for economic growth, that may actually leads to a second round impact in terms of having more returns. Like, for example, take the FBR rates. Mentioning that the FBR rates had been re-evaluated and made at par with the market is not the solution. The problem actually lies in the real estate markets, and we need to develop that, and that is actually going to resolve our crisis in terms of true values for our taxes as well. So this is what needs to be done. Now, further moving on in terms of the thinking of reducing the taxable threshold for the income tax, this is something which PIDE really don't agree with. The report suggests that the salaried class should be having a lower income tax threshold because they think that it is going to bring us more revenue. Does not necessarily brings in, because if you look at the demographics, the lowest part actually contributes very less. This is the first element. Second, they might already be paying through their withholding taxes in the mobile cards and so many other things. Whatever tax is required from them has been paid.
Thank you. This is Nasser. So Dr. Khalid already mentioned a lot of points related to the. When I just raised one point, when you thought about the rigidity of the expenditure, this narrative basically gives you a wrong approach because it misses the underlying phenomena why there is rigidity. The number of ministries, number of departments, number of like these events that cause these rigidities. So how we can solve? So first we have to go for that what Dr. Nadeem already mentioned, that unless we go for that type of reform, so we can observe that, and then so there is no space for expenditure rationalization. That's what you mentioned. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. We fully agree. The part about bringing up high share rigidity is to mean that the share of discretionary expenditure is small. So in order to rebalance your fiscal deficit, you need to look at the rigid parts, which requires reforms, right? It's just can't be. We know many governments do that. They squeeze capital expenditure whenever they have a fiscal deficit. This is not just for Pakistan. Most countries do that, right? But given if your discretionary or your capital expenditure is already so small, you have difficulty squeezing. So that's the point. We fully agree.
Hello, my name is Asif, and I'm a student of development studies at PIDE. So, what you presented about NFC, the pre and post comparison of fiscal deficits, and I have a few comments about that. So the first one is that what goes to provinces in the form of tax revenues is actually the tax revenue and not the non-tax revenues which are kept by the federal government. And number two, tax is a function of tax base. So if you reverse the base, you will see the provinces actually collecting most of the taxes instead of the federal government. Let's say if we reverse the tax base for sales tax, right? And the third is that NFC was with great deliberation, and the comparison of pre and post NFC position in terms of fiscal deficit is fallacious.
So the point about bringing up the NFC, we are not giving any indication whether it's good, bad. It's just an observation, right? Right now, there's what we call fiscal asymmetry, where the federal government spends a lot but keeps less of the revenue, and that's why the fiscal deficit has grown past 2010. So we are just making the observation that this is not sustainable. Something needs to change. So how that change comes about, because it involves a constitution, is up to you as a Pakistani, right? But we are just making the observation that this is not sustainable to continue. Thanks.
My question is that there is, as Dr. Naab already mentioned, that local government is the fruition of the democracy lies in the district governments, and there is a lack of strategic thrust for institutionalizing district governance. And is it that way why we are not more emphasizing on fiscal financial devolution at the grassroots level? And this may be one of the reason that we are growing the fiscal deficit at the federation level.
We haven't really looked.
Because people have not experienced actually the benefit of the district governments. So when people not have an experience, then they cannot change the mindset of that, how important is the district government is.
So we haven't looked down to the district government yet, right? What we brought
But
out
that's
was
the most important area. That is what, I mean, the cumulative effect of the district governance will be finally have a positive impact at the provincial and the federation level.
so at least in the district, okay.
If you just see the history of martial law in Pakistan, all the martial laws were successful in terms of economic development because of the district governments. One mentioned by Dr. Nair during the regime of the Musharraf also.
So our study doesn't actually go on to district governments, but that being said, drawing from cross-country experience, there is many countries that decided to decentralize to district provincial governance to aid service delivery, right? In that sense, if those things are done well, you could see human capital going up, and that could be good for the country. So in what you're saying, we don't disagree with it from that in sense of a potential growth for the economy. Right now, we were more focused on the fiscal deficit and actually how to resolve that issue, right? Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Derek, for your analytical and thought-provoking talk. Well, I just want to talk about that boom and bust cycle that we frequently experience in our economy. You have alluded to a phenomena that whenever the growth trajectory touches a certain point, it always results into a current account deficit afterwards. And we are not yet out of it. So how to make our economy sustainable and overcome this challenge? Thank you.
Yes, so the boom and bust cycle is actually a result of the economy not producing enough. If you are able to produce enough to match what you actually need to buy from the rest of the world, you can solve that problem, right? So that's why a lot of our analysis does, at the same time, while we're worrying about how to stabilize this fiscal deficit, we also emphasize a lot, as in PIDE, on investments, both physical investment as well as human capital investment, right? But beyond that, it's also on exports, right? Where literature shows, and East Asian economies also show, export-led strategy helps you to build human capital, because when you can sell to the rest of the world, you learn how to do it better, right? And that improves the productive capacity of your economy. So it requires a two-pronged approach, making sure that you stabilize the crisis, don't get into too much trouble with the external sector, but at the same time, it needs to be more forward-looking to focus on investments and exports.
Sir, I have two questions. My first question is on salaries. IMF and World Bank has proposed to reduce or rationalize the slabs from 7 to 4. If it's done, then the middle income salaried class taxes will be increased. So what is the exact proposal of the World Bank? And my second question is on tobacco. You have mentioned the one-tier system or premium rates applicable to all. Does the World Bank know that in Pakistan, the share of illicit, which doesn't agree with the PIDE and other research institutions as well, it's more than 50%. So what is the solution of this untaxed cigarette? And they are the more powerful people in Pakistan. Thank you.
I won't comment on the public sector study because I was not involved in that, but more on the excise tax situation. So how we came up with the potential is actually trying to get information from the household survey, looking at how much people consume in terms of tobacco, and then working backwards from there. If everyone paid taxes, what it's supposed to be. So what we're highlighting down here is in terms of the structure of the excises, where we think that people, even if you're legitimate, could go from selling premium cigarettes and pay a lower excise, right? So, but concurrently with that, you do have your tax and trade system where you're trying to squeeze on illicit cigarettes. Before this, I was in Indonesia. Tobacco taxation is actually the third largest revenue stream for Indonesia. So we could understand a bit more. How is it done in Indonesia? Why is there less leakages there compared to Pakistan? This is something that we are trying to do, is in progress. Thank you.